Let me now give the floor to the third speakers before we get into the Q&A session. I know we are a bit pressed for time. Anyway, Alexandros Ragoussis, who is in the IFC World Bank Group, will be enlightening us on investment issues in this context and how can investment proceed in a fragile situation. Thank you.
And I haven't prepared a PowerPoint for this. I think there's an inflation of PowerPoints in these meetings, so I'll just keep my intervention short with a few talking points. But I'll start by picking up on what the other speakers have talked about. So there, I mean, as you all understand, there are two ways of thinking about agriculture and economic activity. Agriculture and fragility, which is a broader way of thinking about economic activity, development, and conflict, right? So you can think about it in a way of how conflict affects economic activity, right? And so it's very difficult to grow businesses, to grow in agriculture when you have situations of risk, or situations of displacement, and you can think of it about it in the reverse way, right? Which is economic activity as a solution to conflict. Thinking about how agriculture, for example, can change conflict dynamics. How can it create resilience? How can it be part of the solution? And this is a more general thinking about the relationship of development and conflict, right? And that's where I think our institutions diverge from the very valid views that James has expressed. So we think that the two cannot be separated. The two approaches, you can't have the two approaches discussed in separate rooms. So poverty and economic exclusion triggers conflict, and conflict creates poverty, right? And then the fact that conflict is not driven only by poverty, and it's not driven only by economic exclusion, does not invalidate the strong relationship that you have between the two. So this is the main reason why you see increasingly development partners engaging in this process. And I'll give you some pieces of data that are specifically for relevant to agriculture. So at the World Bank, we have like James said, we have a list of fragile and conflict-affected countries. These are about 40 countries. Most of them are low income. Not all of them are low income. There are specific criteria that we use to classify them. And then if you look at the top sector in national value added in these countries, as opposed to any other low-income country that you have in the world, then you have two times a greater chance of having agriculture topping any other sector. Are you surprised? No. This is a combination of underdevelopment and risk that keeps these countries one step behind in terms of industrialization. Now, less economic exclusion means a more stable future for them, okay? And we know that agriculture is part of breaking the cycle from economic exclusion and poverty to conflict. And in fact, we have shown, and we have data to show that agriculture is 2 to 4 times more effective in lifting people out of extreme poverty, which is a strong measure of economic exclusion, than investment in any other sector of economic activity. And what is very interesting is what I said earlier, that we didn't used to engage in these conversations as World Bank. 10, 15 years ago, you wouldn't have, when you would talk about economic activity and conflict, when you would talk about conflict in general, you wouldn't have the World Bank in the room. Right? Because these situations, these countries were considered too messy, too risky for us to engage. We wouldn't work there. We would wait for the situations to stabilize, and then we would go in. That has changed, and if there is one point that I would like you to retain from my intervention, is that has changed. We are asked to do more, and we do more in these countries. And a great part of this effort is on agriculture. We invest in agricultural projects, we reassure other investors, we mobilize resources for agriculture, and we work on all sorts of enabling conditions for agriculture to grow so that we can foster basically its potential on addressing economic exclusion and peace. And we have results to show, right? So specifically, for fragile and conflict states, the IFC, which is the private sector arm of the World Bank, has doubled its investment commitments in agriculture only over the course of the past 5 years. And we have also increased 5 times our investment in power and in infrastructure, specifically in fragile and conflict states, which allows basically to take agriculture a step up from where we are at the moment. Has it been easy? No, it hasn't been easy. Why? There are no entry points, right? So agriculture in fragile and conflict states is again a step back from the rest of the world. A lot of it is informal, it's not organized, it's not mechanized, it's targeting resilience rather than growth, right? And I mean, there's plenty of data to support this. I mean, 16% of farmers only have wage jobs in fragile and conflict states in agriculture. And there are projections that this will reach something like 25% into 2030, but this is, again, 1 out of 4. 3 out of 4 people that work in agriculture are not working in an organized manner. So there are no entry points for a development institution to go in and invest and put money in growing the sector. This is also the reason why a lot of these in a lot of these countries, fragile and conflict-affected countries, you don't see a lot of foreign investment coming in, right? So, again, I'll give you a piece of our own analysis. Only 1% of global FDI goes to the 40 countries that I talked to you about. That's 5 times less per capita than anywhere else in the world. Okay, and most of this pie, the foreign investment pie, goes to extractives, telecoms, construction. It doesn't go to agriculture. Why? Because there are no entry points. Because the same problems that we face basically when we try to grow this sector. So how do we do it? How do we grow our investments? We create the entry points ourselves. We place investment offices on the ground. We bring in strong partners. We bring in lead international firms that we reassure, and we connect them with domestic small producers. That would be the case of Cargill, for example, in Côte d'Ivoire. That would be the case of Bayer also in the Ukraine, which is not in the list of fragile states because of all the problems with the list of fragile states that we have. What do? They train cooperative managers. They make sure the supply links are in place. They empower new players outside the conflict ecosystem in order to make agriculture investable. This is the goal. Create these entry points, and then we put resources for investment ourselves. So a big innovation, that happened last year in the last replenishment of IDA was what is called the private sector window. So this is a resources, 2.5 billion in particular, earmarked for investment specifically in fragile and conflict states, and specifically for the private sector where there is no other commercial solution. A large chunk of this money is going to go to agriculture. This is something that we do. Along with our resources, we mobilize also resources from donors, and these are all blended finance initiatives. A good example specifically for that is the GAFSP, so the Global Agriculture and Food Security Program, that is hosted by the World Bank, and it basically mixes concessional finance with commercial finance to address the credit constraints for farmers. And here we're talking about $1.35 billion committed specifically for agriculture. And money is important, but we know that money is not alone going to drive change. So what we also do is we make sure that we provide also other things, like advisory services, for example. That we make sure that both the governments and the cooperatives and the farmers, they have the know-how to grow their businesses. And I'll give you another piece of data that highlights this effort. For every dollar we commit in fragile and conflict states, IFC spends 2 times more in advisory services than in any other low-income country, specifically to address these needs. And we also try to make sure, in addition, that these farmers and these producers, they have access to international markets. Why? Because the domestic markets and domestic income is not enough in fragile and conflict states to grow, to support growth in agriculture. And again, I'll give you another piece of data. IFC guarantees 3 times greater shares of cross-border trade in fragile and conflict states than in any other low-income context. So how do we do it? We place people on the ground, just to summarize. We rely on strong partners. We earmark more resources for investment. We mobilize investment from other sources, from donors, and we provide advisory services, and we make sure that markets are open to international trade. Now, the World Bank Group in general, and the IFC in particular, is the largest multilateral investor in fragile and conflict states by any statistic. So we can pat ourselves on the back and say, well done. Well, we don't do that, right? So, so a lot of our work is also about improving our own processes, our own standards, our own processes and measures of success. We realize that we're far from addressing all the needs. And we realize also that we are far from seeing a tangible change at the macro level. We know that we create stability in local communities. We see that, we hear that, same as the FAO. But in terms of bringing peace at the macro level, we know that we're still far from that, right? So there is a long way to go. And there's a lot of thinking that needs to be done to take us there. So this is why we're also here, to discuss. Thank you.
Merci, Alexandros.
Thank you, Alexandros. A very clear message. And as chairman of this meeting, it's a good thing to have 2 speakers who don't seem to agree with each other.